Welcome back to Buying Sandlot. Today's guest is Representative Chris Deluzio, who is the lead sponsor of the Let Kids Play Act, one of the most significant pieces of proposed youth sports legislation in recent memory. During the episode, we discuss what inspired the framework of the bill, the biggest debates surrounding it, and why the legislation targets vulture practices that he argues are driving up costs and limiting access. Whether you support the Let Kids Play Act or have concerns about its potential impact, we think this is an important conversation about the future of youth sports and one every operator, investor, parent, and policymaker should hear. But before we get into that, we want to thank Black Magic Design Cameras for sponsoring the show. Listen, filming youth sports has come a long way. Organizations can now create new revenue streams from live broadcasts using the same products as professional teams. A hockey club in Michigan can use the same camera that the NHL uses behind the goal. And a baseball facility in California can afford the same cameras Disney used to shoot the latest Marvel movie. That's all thanks to Black Magic Design, who makes it possible. Whether you are a sports facility, club, school, or coach, Black Magic Design allows high quality, affordable, and easy to learn multi-camera streaming and filming. Check out their studio cameras, production switchers, DaVinci Resolve editing and replay tools, and the Black Magic Camera app on iPhone and Android. For more information, please go to blackmagicdesign.com. Now, let's get into the episode. We're here with Representative Chris Deluzio. Chris, thanks for joining Buying Sandlot. We've discussed the Let Kids Play Act quite a bit on here, but maybe give us a 1 to 2 minute version on it to bring the audience up to speed, if you don't mind.
You bet. And thanks for having me on. Let's start with, I think every kid should have a shot to play sports. Like I think in America, sports are a great equalizer, and certainly for kids, every kid should have a shot. I start with that as a goal. My own little kids are starting out playing sports, and what I've seen, and I've heard from parents in my district, and certainly since this bill, I heard from a lot of parents. Parents are priced out, and we've seen. I'll cite you the data. I'm sure we'll get into it. Just how expensive youth sports has become, away from the kind of rec league, community league model that I grew up with. I was born in the mid '80s, so you can do the math on when I was a kid. That model is just under pressure. Kids and parents are getting squeezed, and the more we were digging into this, we started seeing the same story, kind of private equity roll-ups of sports or segments of sports, facilities, tournaments, lots of schemes that were really pricing people out. And so we went at those, what we call vulture practices, the state of play schemes, the locked in on fees and multi-year tuitions, the bans on participating and competing rec leagues, all the kind of stuff that I think is anti-competitive and really has been responsible for driving up costs. So the Let Kids Play Act goes at these practices that I think have driven up costs for families and price kids out, and has a whole bunch of tools. Number one, to go at those practices, but number two, to get refunds for families if they've been ripped off in that way, and to force where there have been these bad actors that own rinks or leagues or fields and you name it, to sell those back to the community, to divest them. There's a process for that, and to challenge it all with the goal to try to reinvest back in community sports and to bring down costs for families. That's my high level. Let's talk about it, but it's really at its core about making sports something that every kid can participate in, and it won't matter what their parents' bank accounts look like.
A couple follow-ups here. What has the reaction been like since you guys proposed it? What and how has it made progress through? And last one for you, what is the path to, you think, getting a version of it passed?
So I didn't know what this would look like when we announced it. I had a sense as a parent, because I know what I hear, on the fields and on the courts from other parents whose kids are a little older than mine, by the way. My oldest is 9. So parents whose kids are a little older, they're already dealing with the travel stuff. I thought this would be something parents would be fired up about. I could not have predicted how much this really took off. I mean, you had USA Today do a big expose, I think even before we were putting the bill out, and then they covered it. We've had lots of podcasts and parents podcasts and sports business and media and all the rest really jump at this. And the biggest part has been parents writing in, and this has not fallen into the Democratic, Republican, normal kind of divide. I'm hearing from parents all over the political map, and that's a good thing, because it tells me the path forward is we can actually build a coalition to do something about what's going on in youth sports. I mean, the data is kind of wild. I'm sure you guys have talked about it. Average family, when you price in gear and travel and all the rest, it's about $1,500 per kid to play sports. And for families that are doing travel sports, I mean, it's into the thousands and tens of thousands. And on average, I mean, this is almost double inflation, like 46% increase in the last 5 years. So it's become a real problem. And I'll say one more thing on this. I caught an interview that Landon Donovan did talking about what's going on in soccer. And he
We just
said,
talked about
if,
this.
yeah, he said, if this was happening when I was a kid, I would not have been able to play. And this is the guy who's one of the greatest soccer players in American history. It's just such a travesty. So we got to do something about it.
Yeah, so I mean, we're definitely one of the sports business publications. I think hopefully we're the only one that's kind of covers the business of youth sports. So we see, listen, I'm a parent to 10 and 7-year-olds, so I see a lot of the
You're in
problems
it.
firsthand. I'm in it for sure. Both boys, both playing, both active, that sort of thing. At the same time, we see a lot of people in the industry, some of the PE folks, some of the independent operators, some of the community folks. So I'll go in the weeds a little bit, maybe, more than some of the other folks you've talked to. But so the bill outlines a lot of the vulture practices, right? And kind of ties them to the covered firm, right? I think a lot of people, including almost everyone I speak to in the industry, generally gets behind many of these, such as the junk fees, the extractive practices. I would describe it as monopolistic behavior, right? And I think Catherine Van Dyke has talked a lot about this, about how some of these are functioning like monopolies, right? So would some of these things be covered by existing antitrust laws that that don't need a separate bill? And how do you kind of draw that distinction there?
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, that might depend on whether enforcers are really willing to take a look and do something, which we haven't seen. I can't force the Federal Trade Commission or the Justice Department's antitrust division to go investigate where there have been roll-ups. And the USA Today, when they covered a lot of this with Black Bear in particular, they talked about the strategy of buying up rinks and then squeezing out the community leagues that happened in the North Hills of Pittsburgh with the Vipers. And I know that story has played out in other parts of the country, but we haven't seen antitrust enforcers do anything about it. And to your point, and I think it's a really good question for exactly this point. When you've managed to roll up something that might seem like a small market, right? Youth hockey rinks and what goes with it. I think that's an anti-competitive problem, and I think we address that, and we address a broader set of problems. But again, I just haven't seen enforcers do anything, and so I'm looking at this as a member of Congress. We've got to give them some more tools to instigate change, and frankly, the divesting part of this is the tool that we can most directly require in the law that isn't at the whim of an antitrust enforcer who might have a disagreement about broader antitrust principles. And I didn't say this, and it's maybe worth saying at the outset too. Like, look, I get that there are plenty of places where different business models make sense in our economy. I think something like youth sports, where there's a public good at stake, different than just regular markets, makes this different, makes it something that a Congress should be worried about the business models and what their practices are. So I do think there's something different at stake for the country when you're talking about youth sports, where kids, and you guys know this, right? You learn a lot on the field, on the court. And so that's part of what animates this for me too.
Maybe, yeah, no, fair point. Maybe as a follow up there, I mean, there's as you outlined, there's definitely some bad actors here, and bad practices. The involvement, I mean, private equity in particular, since it targets largely private equity, is pretty wide in youth sports, right? And we could cite some, I would say, good actors, or at least maybe better actors is a better term, right? Some of those folks who would have that path to the light, so to speak. I'd use examples of like a Youth Athletes United. They own soccer stars, like Young Kids Soccer Participation, Youth Enrichment Brands, I9 Sports. Even Brand Velocity Group just acquired RCX, which partners with the pro leagues. All of these things are generally operators with reasonably priced programs targeted at younger kids. Frankly, a lot of them deploy kind of the exact sort of outcomes that the bill and proponents of the bill seek, right? But on day one, they're kind of automatically considered a vulture, right? So I guess what is their
because of the structure? Is that because of the ownership structure?
Because of the private equity ownership structure, right? Yeah. So, but they really don't employ some of the most aggressive tactics that, have been outlined about, like Black Bear and things like that. So like, what does their path to the light reasonably look like?
Good question. And look, as I understand the way we've drafted this, you can make an attestation that you haven't engaged in these kinds of practices that gets you into a path where you can be in youth sports. And so there is now someone's got to make that attestation, and you'd still be in a problematic territory if you did engage in state of play or some of the junk fees we talk about and the rest. And so, yes, this targets a business model and also defines a set of business practices that if you're willing to attest that you haven't done that and you don't fall victim to doing that kind of thing, I think you can still find a place to be in youth sports. And by the way, you know, this bill, we introduced it in the last month or so. We want to pass this thing. We want to make a law that is workable, that works. And the goal of this is youth sports and youth sports access and affordability. So as we build this thing out, like, we're going to have conversation, we're going to have input. I want us to get a markup and a hearing. And when you do that in a committee, you have stakeholders come and tell you about your legislation and what they're seeing. Like, this is part of the sausage making of legislation that is a good and healthy thing.
Yeah, one of the ones that jumped out to me, I'm, kind of come from a media, a little bit of a tech background. So as I'm kind of reading through the Vulture practices, I see, some around data, live streaming, kids' rights, things like that. Some of these there's definitely privacy concerns there for sure. Some of these are generally less user hostile. Some families, use these apps for registration, Team Snapper, league apps, streaming tech, streaming a baseball game.
I know those ones.
Even some data apps, right? And what we've seen, the complaints are generally like, there's too many of these, right? And maybe they should all be more interoperable, which I'm fully for, by the way. But the ones I mentioned, Team Snap, league apps, they're owned by private equity. Game Changer, which is Dick's, I know Dick's in your district, public company. They're not, right? So some of the things all of those companies do would be considered a vulture practice under this, but it would only target the ones that are owned by private equity, right? So it seems like if the bill takes issue with some of the practices, why is it only, I guess, so narrowly defined for the private equity folks? Because, there's a public company, independently owned, VC-backed things. Tech companies need investment, as we all know.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think, and again, I go to where have we seen the history of the really bad practices? It's coming out of this ownership structure. Now, we can have, and this is the point of, we'll do a markup and we'll have debate on the bill and try to make it as good as we can if we're getting to a place where advancing it. Great. We'll take ideas if we think there's a place where this could drive out good investment. And even on the data privacy part, which we want to protect kids' data, there's nothing in here that's going to stop like the analytics that I know a lot of the older kids love, right? Like, you can't monetize these kids' data, but we're not trying to shut down some of the really cool and interesting data analytics on performance that some of these products are out there for kids. So, we're trying to strike that balance. I think we get it right, but this is the legislative process that if we hear from folks and it makes sense, they're making good arguments that, this might go too far on something that would be good for youth sports, like, great, we'll take that input in.
Maybe talk a little bit about state of play. I know that's a big tenet.
Yeah.
You see lots of consensus there. So kind of give your view of it.
It's kind of wild. And then, as I said, I haven't seen this directly as a parent, but I've heard all about it. I had, constituent write in recently, and I've talked about this publicly. State of play, for your listeners, if they don't know, and I bet a bunch of them do, tells you if you want to participate in this tournament, you've got to stay at this specific hotel at this specific rate, sometimes from, this set number of nights. And as you can imagine, parents hate it. Maybe it's that you could stay with a friend, or you could drive, or you could camp out, any of the options other than, or even book directly on the hotel website or through one of the companies, third party, to be a cheaper rate. And parents get stuck paying these higher fees for the hotels. I don't think there's any real defense to this for costs. And yet, it's one of those strategies we see. And I think it's maybe the most obvious of what we call the vulture practices that really just, man, when you get parents talking about the state of play stuff there, you see the steam coming out of their ears.
I agree. I mean, some of as I mentioned, my kids aren't in the, they're not fully in the travel circuit yet, but I have some neighbors and they play hockey and they go to all these tournaments, and I hear it, every time, like, hey, we had to pay here. It doesn't make sense. I got a card. I had points at this hotel. So yeah, I'm definitely not here to defend state of play. I think what I've heard from people in the space, and again, I'm just sort of presenting what I think the counter to it would be, that, they'll say, hey, like, the room blocks are important. This is one way to do it. And then other organizers have told us, smaller, not PE backed, like, this is actually a revenue line for ICE. We get these commissions from the local Holiday Inn or whatever it is, and it actually helps us control costs. Now, I don't know how much merit there is to that. I'm sure it varies wildly. But like, we did a 450 person conference in April, right? And we actually in Philly, and we struggled with hotel rooms, and we got those blocks were necessary. We didn't get the kickback. Probably we should have, right? But like, what, like, how do you find that balance there? Because I know there are tournament organizers, even smaller ones, who are like particularly concerned about, shoot, like this is actually a line item for me, and I gotta make up that cost somewhere. It's 15-20% of our revenue for a tournament, and it's not predatory necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, you went right at it, right? With this is a revenue line, and it's a kickback in some ways, right? That you're steering, a set number of people to these hotels. Look, I just come back to, if I start at, we have to tackle this cost problem for youth sports, period. And this to me seems like one of the most obvious, if not the most obvious place where, if you're going to ask pretty sophisticated, you know, for-profit operators, PE operators here, that, sorry, this is just one revenue line you don't get to have because we're talking about kids and their families. That's a balance I'm willing to strike. I know that parents are probably with me on that. And like, these are the kinds of calculations we have to make as we're looking at policy. And again, as I say, there's a difference between, midstream energy infrastructure or something and youth sports. And so I'm fine making this calculation that, hey, as policymakers, we're going to say this revenue stream is just out of bounds when it comes to tournaments for kids. And I think, again, because that goal is to keep costs down for families. And look, if the argument then is, well, organizers have a hard time making the numbers work for these tournaments, I push back on, yet I know how profitable these firms have been in youth sports. I mean, they are making real money. You can hear it whenever there is any kind of earnings call with any public facing company involved here. I mean, they're making real money. And so I just have a hard time seeing that this single revenue line is going to be make or break for these pretty powerful firms that have really rolled up different sports and frankly are making a lot of money. So if I'm missing it, tell me, but I just don't see how this is a make or break thing that, these firms are just unable to make it happen if they can't get this revenue.
Yeah, no. I mean, state of play is not the hill I would die on, for sure. But I would say, like, why not go after the practice then, right? I mean, I think the worst example of this that I've read about was a couple of employees for the Dallas Stars. I think USA Today covered this last year. They were self-dealing for Dallas Stars tournaments, obviously not PE backed, right?
Mm-hmm.
The practice occurs outside of PE, like, so again, why not just go after the whole practice?
Well, I think if you look at the bill, we lay out these vulture practices that I think if you're an actor, period, who's engaging in these and youth sports, you're going to be forced to divest or do the other remedies that we have in the bill. And so I sense the tension you're getting at of, well, why this business model or this ownership structure rather than just the practices? I mean, we go at the practices and we go at the ownership structure because it's been so associated with these practices. And again, there is this relief valve of, you can make your attestation that you haven't and won't engage in these. And if you do get caught engaging in these practices, we've got the whole remedy structure of divesting, of the fines, of paying back into that scholarship fund for youth sports. So I think we go at both. And again, we'll refine this if we need to. But the idea is to go at the behaviors and to go at an ownership structure that really has been central to this bad behavior, with, that attestation that you haven't broken the rules and we don't find you breaking the rules.
Yeah, you just talked about the redirected to community programs space.
Mm-hmm.
What is the process for this money being redirected to those community programs? We just had a former Little League exec on. She's the chief of staff of Banana Ball, the Savannah Bananas. She was on yesterday and we just released it. And she said the community-run programs are only as good as the volunteers running them, which happens to be often not great.
It's tough. I mean, and look, like, we get to a bigger discussion of who has time to be doing a lot in their community. And that's a bigger problem for the American dream, if you ask me. It could be volunteer fire departments. It could be coaching youth sports. I mean, it's a big problem. And so, not naive about that fact. The part of this bill that is about, the fines and some of the remedies where you're getting money back from violations, the idea is to direct that into a fund that will support scholarships for families, that will support investment into public fields and facilities. But I've been clear about this in this bill. That's an important part of it. It is not the only thing that Congress should do. Like, the Congress should be supporting more construction and support for youth fields and activities. I mean, I've tried to even support applications from or I've gotten applications in my congressional office for nonprofit sports leagues to support their facilities, and we can't even support that and get it passed because of the rules in the Appropriations Committee in the House. They don't let us support those kinds of programs. I think that's foolish because, again, this is one small revenue stream that could be there for these facilities. But I think it's something, again, this matters for the country. We should be able to support, nonprofits and local leagues who need to do this, who need the resources. And as you say, struggle to get people to volunteer because I think folks are stressed on their time all the time.
So, is there anywhere you see for-profit businesses maybe being helpful to the youth sports ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, look, we just had in the city of Pittsburgh, next to my district, the mayor there got an agreement with the Pittsburgh Pirates and then Lyuna, the laborers union there, both gearing up to make the city's ball fields substantially better. Great. I mean, that's good support from our Major League Ball Club and a union who's got folks working all over the region to make the ball fields better for kids. Great. You mentioned I've got Dick's Sporting Goods in my part of the world, and folks in Pennsylvania and Western Pennsylvania know all about Dick's. I mean, youth sports is not going away. The business of youth sports is not going away. I think the idea here is to direct and steer investment into facilities that every kid can approach and afford. That's open to all comers, and it's part of why I recoil from a lot of the practices that try to steer out the not-for-profit, the community and the rec leagues from, say, the Black Bear owned ice rinks. Like, it's why that really offends people to their core. So there is a place for these leagues. And by the way, for a long time, I bet it's when you guys were kids playing too, the names on the back of those jerseys, those were sponsored by local businesses. That's always been a part of supporting rec leagues, community leagues, was to ask local businesses to support. So I don't think anybody looks at this and says we have to drive out that investment. That's not how I see it. I think the idea is to try to steer back to those public rec leagues that kids can afford.
Two quick ones to finish. I know we only got a couple minutes left. I'll actually stay on the sponsorship. So we've talked to a lot of people that are very bullish on sponsorship, up to and including Samir Ahuja, who's the president of Game Changer for Dick's. And he actually said he sees sponsorship as kind of the next leg up in youth sports. And other folks thinks it's done right at scale. It's a way to potentially subsidize participation costs. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't seen somebody tie the sponsorship to it actually decreasing a cost, but in theory, it makes sense. One of the arguments for that is that consolidation or even tech platforms help to kind of aggregate those eyeballs. So instead of buying Sandlot, I sponsored my son's team that I coached, right? $250, right? But the argument is, hey, you could bundle a bunch of these things together through consolidation. And now you have State Farm or you have Dick's sponsorship. Maybe talk about how you think about how sponsorship can potentially subsidize, and think about that argument you hear from some people.
I mean, look, like the sponsorship of teams, as I said, it goes back a long time. When I was a kid, it was, the local volunteer fire department or the pizza shop or whatever, sponsoring the Little League team. It was maybe something like, you say, $250 to sponsor your kid's team. Like, I do think there is an avenue for that. And I think people want to see that investment in community leagues. I mentioned the higher scale for the city of Pittsburgh wide, where you had the Pirates and Lyuna making a sponsorship and doing something important for the parks. Like that is a thing that should exist, that we should encourage. How that plays out when you start layering in the apps and the rest and the bigger scale, national network of tournaments, I'm less clear. But I want to be pretty clear about this point, though. Like, there is a place, and we should encourage that sponsorship when it comes to youth leagues and all the rest. And by the way, a player like Dick's wants to sell gear. And so kids playing these sports that they can afford is probably good for their business too. Like, that seems to be a pretty, relevant consideration as companies like that think about what to do with youth sports. If you price people out of being able to participate, they're not going to buy your gear. That's relevant to the Nikes and the Rawlings and all the rest, who I think want to probably sell their gear.
Last one for me. I know I got a second left. We surveyed about 180 kind of individual, mostly independently owned operators over the last couple of months in our audience. One of the things we've learned in like a year and a half of running this publication is there's lots of these kind of, call them high six-figure, very low seven-figure businesses that are individuals who are passionate about a sport. They start a business, they start a facility or a baseball club, right? And in many ways, they represent like the best of America, right? They're passionate about something. They build a small business around it. Yeah. And they're actually seeing some of this influx of capital as a way for them to grow. 75% of the people in our survey said they're not looking to cash out. They're not looking to get rich. Where they want private equity or just investment in general is for like a strategic partner and to grow. They don't want to leave the business. They just want to open their next facility. They want
to keep control.
Keep control and expand to the town. So how do you what would you say to that person and kind of square that with, like if PE is scared off, it's like a funding route that dries up for them?
Yeah, it may be a question of control, which is something we should think about. And I have to think about what the way the bill is drafted there. But if it's, if you're retaining control and you're talking about passive investment, right, to open up the capital you might need to make an expansion, that feels maybe a little different than when you've got control and you're engaging in these practices that we see, right? That feels like a very different kind of investment, perhaps. And so maybe the devil's in the details there. But I think what the idea here is to drive investment into these facilities that are open for all. And so we should not be, burying our head in the sand about the need for investment. I think the public side of that is important. That's why, again, I say, yes, there's part of this bill that directs money for remedies, but it's not enough. Like we should have more public investment in the public facilities. That's just one link of it. So I see the need on the privately owned facilities. I see how that investment might make sense, and we should dig in on that too.
Representative Chris Deluzio, we appreciate you coming on Buying Sandlot. Good luck on the bill, and we look forward to having you on in the future and maybe talking more.
We won't talk Steelers Eagles though, but thanks, guys.